Did Jesus rise from the dead without a body? Today's conversation may be the most theologically risky dialogue that we've ever hosted. One guest argues that Jesus' resurrection was a real event, but that there was no body involved. And the other says that that's not just wrong, it literally undermines the very foundation of Christianity itself. Joining me are two heavyweight philosophers. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytic philosopher and author specializing in formal and classical epistemology. She defends the high reliability of the Gospels and Acts in 4 different books, most recently Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. Philip Goff is a philosophy professor at Durham University. His book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, explores alternative ideas of God. And in a recent debate with William Lane Craig, which we've linked in the show notes, he laid out in more detail his sort of mildly heretical version of Christianity that he now holds to. In this episode, these two philosophers clash over what kind of resurrection actually occurred. Was it Jesus' body that actually rose, or was it something else? Did the disciples touch and eat with him, or were their experiences visionary? And does your answer depend more on your view of God than on the text itself? Buckle up. This one dives deep. Let's start with an opening statement from Philip Goff.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me just start by thanking Lydia for being willing to have this conversation. I've long enjoyed and admired your work, Lydia, and I'm looking forward to learning from this conversation. And thanks to Cameron for hosting it. Keep up the good work. Okay, so what I'm going to do, try and do 2 things. I'm firstly going to give a very quick overview of my general view on Christianity and the resurrection as background, and then I'm going to try and quickly get onto the New Testament, which I think we're mainly going to be focusing on, and say a bit about what I think about that. Okay, so first thing to know is that I believe in a God of limited power. Right? I think both traditional theism and traditional atheism have big problems. Traditional theists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain evil and suffering. Traditional atheists tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning, among other things. I think the God of limited powers hypothesis can elegantly account for both of these data points. So very roughly, we explain fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and suffering in terms of God's limitations. Okay, so much more to be said. If you want to know more about that, my recent debate with William Lane Craig went into this in more detail, or my book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe. But I'll just leave with that overview for now. Okay, so the resurrection raises some distinctive problems given the view I've just outlined. So the reason I think the suffering is because God can't stop it, right? But if God can raise people from the dead, you start to think God can prevent a lot more suffering, right? If someone dies tragically young, raise them from the dead. I also think it perhaps introduces a problem of hiddenness, this very important aspect of the problem of evil. Why is God's existence not more evident? If Jesus bodily rose from the dead, it seems to me he could have revealed himself to millions. Especially if his body had supernatural powers, he could have flown around the world, making the truth of Christianity, the existence of God, beyond reasonable doubt. Okay, so to get around this, I adopt what I call the identity theory, the view that the resurrection and the ascension are one and the same event. So we don't have this picture where Jesus rises from the dead, hangs around for a bit, and then floats up to heaven. The moment, the event of Jesus rising is one and the same as the event of Jesus returning to the Father. Okay, so what about the resurrection experiences? I adopt an objective vision theory where the resurrection experiences were visionary rather than consisting of seeing and touching a body in the usual way. So maybe a little bit more like how we imagine Paul's experience of Jesus. So, I mean, I know there's some debate about how exactly we understand what's going on there, but something a little bit closer to that maybe. So my picture of the first Easter Sunday is the first Christians, Mary Magdalene, then Peter, then the 11 disciples and so on, are getting thrown to the ground, having these wild, overwhelming visions, and that kickstarts Christianity. Okay, but what caused these visions? Well, here I build on something I find independently plausible, how the Eastern Orthodox Church thinks about salvation. So the basic idea here is that God shared in our form of existence so that we can share in God's form of existence. So think about the vine and the branches, Jesus' metaphor of the vine and the branches. There's a intimate organic unity between a vine and its branches. So the idea here is that we have the potential to enter into a state of deep oneness or unity with God. And this is made possible through God sharing in our form of existence, culminating with the death and resurrection. They call this theosis or divinization. So my hypothesis is that during his ministry, Jesus prepped his followers to be in the right state of mind and being, such that at the very moment theosis becomes possible, they will enter into a deep state of theosis, of unity with God. And he also prepped them to comprehend the metaphysical underpinnings of what's going on to the extent that they're able, and that he did this through the concept of resurrection. So this is why on the Easter Sunday morning, pretty quickly, the followers of Jesus start getting thrown to the ground, overwhelmed with these intense mystical visions and intense unity with God, and that they describe this as Jesus having resurrected. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. Now let's get to, that was good timing, actually. Now let's get to what we're mainly focusing on here. How do I understand what's going on in the New Testament? I do think there are some aspects of the Gospel's resurrection stories that fit better with my view, but I'll leave that. Maybe we could get to that in the discussion. What I'm going to focus on here is the bits that are a little bit more challenging for my view. These bits of the gospel resurrection stories where it seems much more corporeal, okay? What can I say and how can I explain how we have these descriptions? Well, I think there are three kinds of possibilities I can appeal to, and some of them I find more plausible in some cases, some in others. So here are the three possibilities, and then I'll get to how I think of applying these in more concrete form. So firstly, to some extent, the gospel writers might have invented some details. Now, I am very sympathetic to Lydia to the extent that her and others, I think, have made a good case that the gospel writers did have access to eyewitness testimony, and they got a lot right historically on that basis. But I want to say that's consistent with adding some details. Why would they do that? Why would they sort of make things up? Well, it might be because in certain bits of the story, they lack eyewitness testimony and they construct the narrative as best they can, focusing on what is of theological significance. Or it might be that it's part of the symbolism in some cases, right? And so they're not so focused on, literally what happened. I don't think we need to think of the gospel writers as being concerned with exactly what happened in the way a contemporary journalist would. Sometimes they're focused on what's of theological significance, and there will some symbolism will enter into it. So here's two examples where I find this plausible. One from John's Gospel epilogue, where we have the miraculous catch of fish. We have it says there was 153 fish, and saints throughout history, Augustine, Gregory the Great, St. Jerome, have found some numerical significance, some symbolic significance in this number. What happened here? I mean, are we to suppose, I'd be curious to know what Lydia thinks of this. Are we to suppose that somebody counted the fish and kept a note of this and it was passed down? Why would they do that? I mean, maybe. It seems to me more plausible that sort of the writer of John's Gospel didn't really care exactly how many fish there were. This is some kind of symbolic point, although it's difficult to track down exactly what the symbolism was. And that's the point of this. So in some sense, this is invented. Or think about the Magnificat, right? This beautiful 10 verses or so of, song or poetry that Mary speaks when she meets Elizabeth, when she's pregnant. I wrote a bit of it down here, right? My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. He has filled the hungry with good things, but sent rich away empty. It's, this is fairly lengthy. What happened here? Are we to suppose that is exactly what Mary said? Did she make a note of it? I assume it's more plausible that she was illiterate. Did she memorize it? It's passed down kind of Quran style. I think it's possible. I think it's more plausible that Luke kind of doesn't care what exactly she said. He's making a symbolic point about what the birth of Jesus theologically represented. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility I can appeal to are corporeal seeming visions. So Dale Allison has described in great detail how many visions and grief hallucinations involve a sense of touching or being touched. Perhaps this is what's going on in some of the more corporeal visions. And finally, there might be some story development. I do think they appeal to eyewitness testimony, but perhaps they also had some stories. The gospel writers also got some stories picked up secondhand or third hand, fourth hand, and some may have altered in the decades between when they happened and when the gospel writers picked them up. Okay, so let's get specific. That was a bit loud, isn't it? I'm going to say what I think of 4 challenging cases for me. So firstly, in John's gospel and in Luke's gospel, in John's gospel, we have the Jesus breathing on the disciples. And in Luke and John, we have Jesus inviting people to touch him. Well, my hypothesis here is that these resurrection experiences were phenomenologically similar to experiences of being breathed on or being touched, or touching. I find this particularly plausible in the being breathed on case. I mean, are we to suppose that Jesus, when he first appears, if he's there in bodily form, he literally goes up and breathes on them? It sort of feels like theatrical and a bit kind of silly. It's much more plausible to me that this is a sort of visionary experience of receiving the Holy Spirit that is somewhat akin to a sense of being breathed on. It's not so obvious to me in the case of touching, but I think that it's not so obvious it's not that either. It actually doesn't say in either gospel that people did touch him, but perhaps you might think that's implied. I think this is, returning to the second case, I think this is harder for me to say with Jesus eating fish from Luke's gospel because, it says that they kind of went and got the fish for him. So I think that's a bit trickier. Here's my hypothesis here. I think what is going on here is Luke is reconstructing this event as best he can, given what he knows about reality. And I think he's trying to convey 2 things of theological importance: that the resurrection was physical. The Gnostics were wrong, right? This isn't a purely spiritual thing. The resurrection is physical. And that Jesus returned to the Father, right? So Luke thinks, well, what if physically alive people eat stuff? So he has him eating something. And then, we need to get the physical body to the Father. Well, heaven's up there. So, he must have floated up. Now, I would say, we know one bit of his understanding is wrong here in terms of the ascension, that we now know heaven isn't up there. In my view, his view of the resurrected body was also similarly in error. I believe that as resurrected bodies, we just as we don't marry and we're not given in marriage, we don't eat fish, right? Because we are like the angels in heaven, right? But nonetheless, I stand by what I think Luke was theologically trying to convey here, that the resurrection was physical and that Jesus physically returned to the Father. I accept both of those. I just think he was trying to convey that with his, in some ways, incorrect understanding of the world. And just finally on this, I do think there's maybe a similarity in a certain sense to the Magnificat. Both feel to me like Luke's just trying to make a point. Is he trying to say that Mary kind of really broke into song like in a musical? I think he's just trying to make the point of what the birth of Jesus meant theologically. Likewise, the eating fish thing seems so kind of in your face. I mean, when Jesus sees his beloved disciples who have been mourning for him for the first time, is his priority really to have some fish? I'm inclined to think it's plausible, at least, that Luke kind of didn't care whether he really ate fish at that particular time. He's just trying to convey, in strong opposition to early Gnostics, perhaps, that's somewhat speculative, that this was physical. And I accept that. Okay, turning to the road, I'll be a bit quicker now. Turning to Road to Emmaus conversation. This is tricky for me, I think, because there's a detailed conversation between 3 people. it's difficult to make sense of in my view of the resurrection, I think. Here I'm inclined to say that the story was modified in the telling, that the gospel writer, Luke, is not receiving this from Cleopas. He's receiving it passed down, and it's been altered slightly. Not saying there's any evidence that is the case, but it's not clear to me that there's strong evidence that that's not the case. I am inclined to think there was a person, Cleopas, that this is a historical event, because, this is a somewhat obscure name, and we have this place, Emmaus, labeled, and it, you have a shorter version of it in the added end of Mark's gospel. But I think that's consistent. That doesn't mean Luke spoke to Cleopas himself. And finally, I want to spend a little bit longer on this. I'm going to finish as quick as I can. This is the last thing I want to spend a little bit of time on. So what about what's pictured here in the epilogue of John's gospel? Jesus cooking on the shore. Okay, this is cooking breakfast. This is difficult for me to make sense of. I find this epilogue so interesting, so I just want to dwell on it a little bit. Because, okay, so we have the penultimate chapter of John's gospel, 20, where it seems to be coming to an end. What does it say? It says, Jesus did many things. They were brought together so you could believe, or whatever. I can't remember it exactly. It feels like it's coming to an end. Then we get this epilogue. And towards the end of the epilogue, we've got a conversation between the risen Jesus and Peter. The risen Jesus makes clear to Peter that he's going to be martyred. And Peter says, what about this guy? Pointing to the beloved disciple, this character who pops up throughout John's gospel. And Jesus says, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not impressive photographic memory. Anyway, well, what's it to you if I want him to stick around until I come back, And then the narrator says, and so there arose this idea that the beloved disciple would stick around until Jesus returned. But that's not what Jesus said. He only said, if I want him to. And then the narrator said, and this is the person we've got this testimony from, and we believe it. Now, what's going on here? I think there's a really, really plausible explanation of what's going on here. That there was a long-lived disciple of Jesus, the beloved disciple, whether it's John, son of Zebedee is another question, but there was a long-lived disciple of Jesus. A community grows up around him, and this gospel is written not by the beloved disciple himself, but by someone in this community. I think that it's more plausible that as Christianity gets bigger, there's going to be someone in the communities that's literate, as opposed to someone, an initial follower of Jesus. But this gospel is rooted in, very much built on testimony of this disciple. And then over time, because this guy lives so long, there emerges this idea that he's going to stick around till Jesus comes back. The gospel is completed when he's alive. Initially, it's 20 chapters. And then he dies, and it's like, oh shit, well, we've got to explain this away. So you add another chapter explaining away why. Oh, no. Jesus didn't say this, that he was going to. So in a way, this is, if that's right, it seems plausible to me. If that's right, it's kind of good for conservative scholars, good for liberal scholars. In a way, it's good for conservative scholars because you've got like an eyewitness bit of testimony here. It's not like the ultra liberal idea that this is all just later development. But you've also got the more liberal idea that this last resurrection account is kind of made up. And I think this fits well with what we find in John's gospel. Finally, I think Lydia's made a good case that there's a lot of good historical accuracy there, but I think there's also a lot of symbolism, and I think we can make sense of this if there is this, if there is this source of testimony that's influencing. But there is also a perhaps younger, literate Greek writer who's more focused on the symbolism. To some extent, focused on the symbolism. Okay, just summing up. So what I hope I can give is an adequate explanation of why we have the resurrection descriptions we find in the New Testament. Crucially, I'm not saying my explanation is better than Lydia's. The reason I go for my explanation is that, in my humble opinion, the omnigod is very improbable, and hence any theory of the resurrection premised on the omnigod has a very low prior. And I think the evidence for the resurrection, while significant, is not strong enough to overcome such a low prior. So in any probabilistic reasoning, as Lydia well knows, you got to take into account two things. How well does your hypothesis account for the data? But also, how probable is your hypothesis to start off with? I think the traditional view, relative to my view that the omni-God is very improbable. It's just got too low a prior to get anywhere, to get you anywhere. But my view, I think, has a fairly good prior to start off with. My view of the resurrection, I think it gives a pretty good account of the data. So I think, the more and more I work on this and through these discussions as well and with Craig and stuff, I'm starting to think there's a pretty bloody good case for this, actually, surprising myself. But I think I'm sort of like credence to about 60% now, so which I didn't expect. But anyway, yes, that's all I've got to say. I'd like to be curious to know Lydia's thoughts on this.
All right, Philip, thank you for your opening presentation. We'll now turn it over to Lydia.
Thanks, Cameron, and thank you, Philip. Thank you guys both for doing this with me. I don't have PowerPoints, so I'm just going to do this with, I have notes. I'm going to do this with notes. So some of the things that Philip raised that he said he would be interested to hear what I had to say about, I'm probably going to postpone to our dialogue after I'm done. And then, Philip can sort of decide what he wants to prioritize, or I can decide what I want to prioritize to answer, rather than having this presentation answering everything he said. Briefly, in introduction, I want to mention that in Philip's presentation, he used two words. He used physical and bodily. And I know he's not trying to obscure anything, but just for viewers to clarify, physical resurrection and bodily resurrection in Philip's usage do not mean the same thing. And so what we agreed ahead of time was we disagree about whether Jesus was raised bodily. And Philip made that clear. And his being raised bodily would be his being raised in a body that is at least sufficiently like ours, that it's capable of eating, the normal default, unless Jesus did some miracle to make it impossible, but the normal default is that someone passing by him would be able to see him, would be able to touch him. So it would be accessible to normal senses and so forth, as opposed to a vision. When Philip says that he holds that it was physical, what he's said in a paper that he sent to me is that maybe Jesus was raised as some kind of energy, so some kind of mass energy or whatever, but not a body sufficiently like our own that it would have bones, like Jesus says, a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. He says that in Luke. So just so people understand that physical means something maybe a little bit different from what the audience might think of physical as synonymous with bodily, but in this context, it's not. Okay. Now, my case for the bodily resurrection of Jesus rests on a background, and I'll see how many examples I want to give of this when I see how much time I'm taking, a background of evidence that the Gospels and Acts are highly reliable. And I use highly reliable rather than generally reliable because I want to convey that notion that they don't invent stuff. They don't invent either details or important things like whether Jesus appeared in bodily form and so forth. It does not necessitate inerrancy, though my view would be consistent with inerrancy, but it would also be consistent with errancy. But the errors, if there were any, would be of such a sort as people who are close to the facts and trying very hard to be literally truthful when they're presenting something as historical in a seamless fashion, errors such as such people could make. And we all know people like that. I hope I'm a person like that. And Cameron and Philip, that they're, if they're telling me a story, they're not making stuff up, but they might forget whether something was, a Monday versus a Wednesday or whatever. They might just accidentally get it wrong. And I think this is probabilified by all of that evidence. And it's just wealth. It's just an embarrassment of riches. It's amazing. For their actually getting things right, and also by their statements of intention. John, for example, says, the one who saw it bore record, and his record is true. And he says it explicitly apropos of the piercing of Jesus' side and the blood and the water, very gruesome, flowing out, which he gives theological significance to. He says that it fulfilled the Old Testament, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. But then he immediately turns around and emphasizes it really happened. I saw it. So there's very far from there being a tension between making a theological or symbolic point and being literal. He seems to see symbolic or theological significance as arising from literal fact. And then Luke, of course, in his introduction, both to Luke and to Acts, he specifically says to this person, Theophilus, whoever he was, that he's followed these things from the beginning so that Theophilus can be assured of the truth of what he'd been taught. So Theophilus was maybe a convert, a catechumen of some kind. And I think we should take those seriously. All right. Now, with all of this in the background, I would argue that the resurrection stories, including the one in Acts 1, where Jesus talks with his disciples before he ascends, represent at least what the original alleged witnesses claimed. So I call them alleged witnesses because I'm trying not to beg the question about whether it happened, but it represents what they claimed, and that the book of Acts accurately represents the context in which they claimed it. So those early events of they're speaking on the day of Pentecost and they're getting threatened by the religious leaders and beaten by the religious leaders and so forth. And that represents that context accurately. Now, the stories definitely represent Jesus as being bodily raised. Notice that the whole doubting Thomas sequence takes place within a group context. That is to say, when Jesus says to Thomas, hey, touch my wounds in my finger and put your hand in my side, it's in a group. Thomas is not alone with Jesus. And if you read Allison, even when I think frankly that Dale Allison doesn't make enough use of the hypothesis that some of the accounts he's gathering, just kind of like to gather up these grief hallucination accounts. Some people might just be lying because they're not suffering anything for it. But even aside from that, he does not present any account in which multiple people are invited to touch someone, multiple people are interacting with someone, in a group in a tangible way. It's an individual, like a girl lying in bed who seems to see her grandfather and she can touch his beard and so forth. Whereas the Doubting Thomas sequence is a sequence because Jesus comes to them. Thomas is not there. The first time he shows them his hand inside. And then that's the reason why Thomas says, hey, unless I can touch his hand inside, I won't believe it, because they've told him. It's implied that they told him that Jesus showed them his hand inside. Then Jesus shows up 8 days later and offers that. And in Luke as well, and I believe this is the first one told in John, and Luke's just telling it from a different perspective. Jesus is like insistent. I mean, as Philip even said, he's in your face, no, I am not a ghost. Touch and handle me. So, what are we going to say? Hey, fortunately, nobody took him up on that, because if they'd actually taken him up on that, their hand would have gone right through. No, I mean, there's no question that the accounts are presenting him as bodily raised. All right, well, why do I emphasize this? Well, because I tend to use a trilemma structure for this, how to explain the witnesses attesting to this content, that they were sincerely mistaken. All right, it really seemed to them that this happened, but they were just somehow mistaken, or they were lying, or it really happened. Okay, and the sincerely mistaken option is really hard to float once you get into the nitty-gritty. That, this whole group of people, they're seeing Jesus like from different angles. They're hearing him from different angles. They're handing him a piece of fish and it doesn't just drop on the floor. Something I want to really emphasize here, super important, in not a single one of the accounts that's presented as occurring in those 6 weeks right after Jesus' resurrection, Luke mentions 40 days, which I take to be approximately 6 weeks. In not a single account do you have certain people or persons in the group carrying on a conversation with Jesus or saying, oh my gosh, there he is, and touching him, and other people in the group going, what? Nobody's there, okay? Or all I'm hearing is wah, 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 wah. I'm hearing just some kind of weird thundery noise, and you seem to be hearing words. Not a single one of them is like that. When there are groups, we are, I think, meant to believe that the groups are all normally interacting with him, qua groups. And that's really hard to just be mistaken about. Now, and crucially, I don't believe that any of the grief hallucination literature contains all of these elements. In fact, at one point, Allison kind of admits that, and that's why he characterizes some of these things as just being later apologetic additions. Now, the other possibility would be that they were lying, or that some of the people involved were lying. But the context of the original testimony and of what those disciples, all 11 of them, Luke emphasizes the 11 stood up with Peter on the day of Pentecost, and he emphasizes that it was 11 because they've elected Matthias as a witness. They get persecuted, they get beaten, they get, and they know that that's likely to happen. Jesus just was horribly crucified 6 weeks ago due to a kind of agreement between the religious leaders and Pilate. Okay, we got to crucify this guy because, they told Pilate he was an insurrectionist and pressured Pilate, and then Pilate went along with it. And I think that makes it a very hard sell that they were making things up. Now, I'm going to try to talk about a few of the categories and just a very few examples within those categories of evidence of their being highly reliable, as I've said, not just generally reliable. Before I do so, I want to emphasize something concerning Luke and the other gospel authors, including whoever Philip thinks wrote John 21. I actually think it was the same author. I just think it's kind of an appendix where he's like, oh, I want to tell this other story. That happens. You'll have a main story and then, epilogue. Here's something else that happened. But suppose that Philip were right. These other people would be writing it. I think it's easy to use euphemisms. This is a super important point. It's easy to use euphemisms like apologetic embellishment, adding a few details, making up some details, filling out. Okay, these like sort of euphemistic, right? I use a phrase: fake points don't make points. So I want to imagine, for example, we have Luke here, and so Philip mentioned in his talk, this is also in the paper draft that he sent me ahead of time, that maybe Luke was trying to counter Gnosticism or proto-Gnosticism in his own time, where a Gnostic would say Jesus' resurrection was not physical, and it was just spiritual. And suppose that Luke really believed that it was not only physical in Philip's somewhat unusual sense, but even bodily. And I gather Philip thinks that Luke did believe that it was bodily, because that's why he believed Jesus' body had to go back to heaven. And so Luke wants to counter that proto-Gnosticism that he sees arising. So he makes up this thing where Jesus is so in your face, like, touch me, handle me, and see, I have bones, and so forth. And they're still like, what? Unbelieving for joy, it says. And so he says, bring me some food. And that Luke made that up. All right, so Luke's, to make it vivid, he's got a friend who's being tempted to become a proto-Gnostic. And they're having this earnest conversation, and Luke is saying, man, you're wrong. Jesus' resurrection, it was not just spiritual. And Luke says, he even told them when he thought they might be thinking he was a ghost to go get him some food so he could prove to them he wasn't a ghost. He even invited them to handle him and see that he had bones and so on. And Luke's friend goes, oh, really? Oh, well, gee, maybe these Gnostics I'm talking to are wrong. Oh, that happened, huh? Really, Luke, that happened? And Luke goes, well, no, actually, I made it up. Luke goes, I'm just trying to illustrate to you vividly that his resurrection was not just spiritual. And his friend goes, okay, so this is just creative foot stomping, Luke. You know, you're just kind of, I know you think the Gnostics are wrong, okay? I already knew that. When you said that stuff about him eating and offering them to hold his bones, that was supposed to have some additional force other than my friend Luke thinks the Gnostics are wrong, because it really happened. So it's this fake points don't make points thing. If you want to use the word apologetic additions, what is apologetics? It's to convince somebody of something. Now, if you're gonna, because that's the whole point, right? We want to convince people that Jesus was really bodily raised. It only works to convince somebody if they believe it's true. So if you make something up that you know you're just making up, you have no independent evidence that this really happened. You know you're just, fleshing out. But in fact, the scene is coming straight out of your head, okay? And you're presenting it in a context where you're hoping it'll convince somebody. And you know it's not going to convince that guy unless he believes it really happened. Okay, there's a word for that, and that word is deception. That's a lie. And no kind of, softening or euphemism is going to change that. An apologetic elaboration intended to counter something that you think you don't want people to think, that takes the form of an apparently historical narrative to counter that, is a lie. And I would say the same thing about these alleged disciples of the beloved disciple who allegedly wrote John 21. How are they going to cover up their embarrassment? Well, it's by making up a conversation with Jesus that they know they just made up. And even making up a whole scene that they know they made up that includes fish and fishing and dragging it in and so forth. All is the setting for this conversation that's supposed to unembarrass them. Well, how does it unembarrass them? Because people think it really happened. Okay, that's really important. And I probably took so much time with that I haven't left myself time for a lot of details, but I'm just going to give some categories. And one of the great things about the evidence for this high reliability and what I call reportage is that it has categories within categories, and examples within categories of categories. You get this hierarchical sort of structure, this layered structure. So we usually speak in terms of external evidence and internal evidence. External evidence would be things like comparing the Gospels to what we know independently. There's such a wealth of these in Acts written by the same author as Luke, and that, I think we can agree, it's the same guy. And Colin Hemer's magisterial book, the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, has so many of these. It's just amazing. For example, the exact right form of the name of this place, Petara, which is very sort of obscure, neuter plural, and we only have this attested from inscriptions. And they landed there, they went there and they found a ship. And Acts has the exact right form of that name in the middle of a wee passage where the author presents himself as a companion of Paul traveling with him. The name statistics argument, which we can maybe talk about more if we want to in the dialogue, is an external kind of evidence. internal evidence, of course, I'm really well known for, and my husband Tim as well, undesigned coincidences, which is a type of internal evidence. In internal evidence, we're not begging the question and assuming that these things are true, but we're noting features within them that match what we know of how true stories look and how true stories intersect and so forth. And so since undesigned coincidences have been canvassed so often, the couple of categories I'm going to give right here real quickly are going to be different ones, different categories. One would be unnecessary, odd details that produce what I call the texture of testimony. One of my favorites of these occurs right in that John 21 passage that Philip thinks was written by people who were not there at all, who were in fact making up this scene to cover their embarrassment because the beloved disciple died. When they recognized Jesus on the shore, the beloved disciple said, "It is the Lord." And Peter, being Peter, jumps in, very, very consistent with Peter's personality, as we find it all over the place. It says briefly, he puts on his coat before he jumps in. And the only explanation is he was stripped for work. But that's still weird, because if you want to swim, normally you would take off your coat. In fact, I wrote it down as Peter takes off his coat when I was typing these notes, because it's so natural to say takes off that I keep wording it the opposite of what it actually says. It says he put it on, and then it just kind of moves on. Now, I call that the texture of testimony. It just gets this thing thrown in. There's no point to it. And another one, also from John, which receives a lot of attention as supposedly being symbolic, meaning that he made stuff up, okay? Johannine asides. So it's a big thing among scholars to say the author of the Gospel of John felt that because he was inspired by the Holy Spirit, he was justified in kind of putting his own words into Jesus' mouth, as long as they were things that he thought were consistent with the theology that Jesus taught. So he's kind of making Jesus his sock puppet, but in doing so, he's trying to remain sort of within the ambit of what he thinks is correct theology and what is compatible with what Jesus historically taught. All by itself, I think these asides are very strong evidence against that view. Again and again in John, we find he'll report something as being said by the historical Jesus, and then he'll stop, and then he'll sort of break the fourth wall, and he'll say, this is what that meant. This is what he meant by that. An example would be they ask Jesus if he'll give a sign that he's allowed to cleanse the temple in John 2. Like, what sign do you give? And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. John 2. And then John pauses. He hits pause on his narrative, and he said this concerning the temple of his body, because the rulers assume he's talking about the actual temple. Jesus doesn't explain it, that it's a metaphor, but the narrator explains it. Now, if the narrator was the sort of person who had this relationship to truth that he could embellish as long as he remained within theological correctness, there's no reason for him to hit pause. In fact, he could easily have constructed a scene of a kind that, in fact, we find a lot in the Gospels, where the disciples come to Jesus later and they say, hey, what did you mean by that? That was weird, like happens with Jesus' parables. And Jesus would explain, I'm going to rise again, and that's what I meant by destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. There would have been easy ways for him to put that in Jesus' mouth. But again and again, we find this scrupulousness of this is historically said. Now, in my voice, this is what it meant. And that happens a lot in John. And so I just want to wind up this very briefly by saying, I believe all this attests to the kind of people that the authors were and their relationship to truth, both in their capabilities of getting it right and in their intentions of conveying what really historically happened. So that is, in outline, my case for the bodily resurrection of Jesus.
I wonder if you guys, as we jump now into the discussion period, I wonder if you wouldn't mind, Philip, if I just say a couple things about your opening presentation. I really appreciated how when you summarized your presentation, you mentioned how your view on Jesus' resurrection and what that actually looks like and how you interpret the different passages that we see in the Gospels. You said that basically flows from your views about the nature of God. You said that you think that God, the omni-God hypothesis, has a very low prior probability, and so that sort of paints the way that you interpret what we see in the Gospels. And I appreciate that you made that explicit, because I was going to bring that up, but then you summarized it in your closing statement. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because I think that might be central to the disagreement between the two of you. And so I wanted to ask this question. Suppose that, and this is a hypothetical, suppose that you didn't have that low prior probability of the omni-God hypothesis, that you were a more traditional style theist. Suppose that was your view. Would you then agree with the majority of what Lydia says, or would you still want to push back?
That's a really good question, and I think I'd probably have to think about it a bit more. I mean, it's two things, isn't it? Yes, it is the prior that's very much constraining me. But I don't feel like this is very forced, actually. I think those interpretations I gave, I don't feel like, oh God, this is really difficult to make sense of. So I do think this is a fairly satisfactory account of the data, but it's very much the one I'm good. But there is very much that pressure from the low prior I give to the traditional view to push me in that direction. But yeah, so it's the two things together. I think I just have to think a lot more about, with Lydia's undesigned coincidences. I mean, they're fascinating, and there's many of them, and there's very often something to it. You sort of, but I guess I don't feel overwhelmed to feel a strong pressure that I need to come to the traditional view. Maybe I'd come closer if there was that difference in the prior, but I'd have to really really think that through.
Lydia, do you have any thoughts on that question?
As to what Philip would do, I don't know what Philip would do. I don't want to.
Well, no,
put
I
words in his
meant
mouth.
I was mainly, I guess, asking you what are your thoughts on perhaps if he were to answer in the affirmative and say, well, yes, I would come closer to your view, would you then be sort of influenced to want to push back on it? Because I know that this is sort of a side question, but I think it sort of hits at the heart maybe of Philip's view here is that because he has a low prior of the omni-God hypothesis. I mean, I know it's a bit tangential to sort of shift gears and stop talking about the bodily resurrection and then start talking about his reasons for thinking that the omni-God hypothesis has a low prior. But I do think, and it sounded to me, Philip, from your opening presentation, that's a very big central part of your interpretation. Yes.
You can ask Lydia the converse question. You can say, suppose you had, a prior for an all-powerful God as, 0.0001 or something, would you still be persuaded by the evidence of for the resurrection?
Yes.
Okay.
That is a good point. But that's a separate question from what I was going to ask to Lydia, but I think it's fair to ask her that question because it's related to the one that I asked you. So sure.
So that's an interesting question. Cameron and Philip, both of you, about what I would do if I had a really low prior for an omni-God. The first thing I'm going to say is something I hesitated about saying because it kind of gives Philip an out in holding a position that neither he nor I hold. Okay, that is a third position. It would be at least logically possible to hold that God has limited power, but that Jesus rose bodily from the dead anyway. I mean, I think Philip and I actually agree that you kind of need an omni-God to raise somebody bodily from the dead, but we might as well say explicitly that that's not a logical necessity. It's more of a metaphysical a metaphysical intuition, but not like an overwhelming metaphysical intuition. I think it's true, probably he thinks it's true, that a God of limited power wouldn't be able to raise man from the dead after, how many hours it was. We're not talking about somebody who was just drowned a half hour ago or something, but the cold corpse has been lying in the grave for several days. So I'm not actually suggesting that position, but I'm just bringing it up as a logical possibility. Secondly, I do not consider Philip's explanations of the data to be even remotely adequate. I mean, they're just not even close. We don't have independent evidence, accepted evidence of groups of people who are suffering from grief hallucinations or whatever, who are having these kinds of experiences. Dale Allison does this interesting thing, and to some extent, when I was reading Philip's paper, he kind of does it too, that I call booping back and forth, very technical term. On the one hand, you kind of go, oh, well, some of this phenomenology could be sort of like this. Sometimes people touch people in grief hallucinations, but then, when something's too incongruous with it, like this guy going, hey, all you guys, like, grab me and go ahead, prove that I'm not, and he's talking to a group, that I'm not a spirit, then the boop goes over to, well, it's probably an addition. It's probably an apologetic addition. And I'm not even necessarily saying that's like logically inconsistent, but I think it shows that there isn't some other independently known phenomenon in which groups of people have experiences that are phenomenologically of the kind that are reported in the stories. And they're not real. Okay. It didn't really, when it didn't really happen, because they're these very, very detailed stories. And so that's one reason for not considering it even remotely adequate. And another reason is that I believe we have zero evidence for and massive amounts of evidence against the view of the authors as people who thought it was okay to make stuff up. And to make a point, notice that at the end of John 21, like the last, I think it's 2, maybe 3 verses at the very end of that chapter, I think that's probably a coda. Like, that's the only part that I think was written by somebody else. It's like the last 2, 3 verses, because it kind of changes voice, and it says, this is the disciple who wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true, and so forth. And I think of it as being kind of like a Post-it note, that, if I wrote something and I didn't happen to include a title page with my name on it, somebody else could come along and write, on a yellow Post-it note, this is by Lydia McGrew, and like stick it onto the stapled manuscript. And so I think of that as being what that is. There's this insistence that it's literally historically true. Indeed, to such a point that it even makes this really specific distinction between this rumor that's arisen and what Jesus historically said. Now, if you're going to insist on that, you're going to make a big deal about that. This is what he really said, and it wasn't this. So, we shouldn't assume this guy's going to live forever. And you're trying to cover your embarrassment, and then you're going, the beloved disciple wrote these things, apparently referring to, everything that comes before. That's really deceptive. And I think we have no evidence at all that the authors thought it was okay to do that. There's a casualness within New Testament scholarship, certainly on the part of Dr. Allison, but just many others, a casualness to saying, oh, well, maybe that was an apologetic addition. Oh, well, maybe that was just an embellishment. Like, they assume that everybody's just going to grant that the prior, that these authors thought that was a fine thing to do. I think we just have enormous evidence that they did not think that was a fine thing to do. So what this all leads to is that the evidence that these accounts do come from the alleged eyewitnesses, which the alleged eyewitnesses were telling in that context of intense initial persecution, is so strong that you can back solve probabilistically for a prior probability, a very low prior probability, that it could in fact overcome. So I would like to think that even if I had a low prior probability of an omni-God, and even if I shared the metaphysical intuition that only an omni-God could raise Jesus bodily from the dead, I would still be able to recognize the enormous, as I would call it, Bayes factor, the force of that evidence for the bodily resurrection, and conclude, well, it looks like the bodily resurrection did happen, so I'm going to have to change some other views somewhere else over here, whether it be an omni-God or whatever.
So what I'd like to do at this point is sort of not necessarily switch gears, but what I'd like to do is make it more concrete. So Philip, if you wouldn't mind, and I want to do this, I'm going to pass over to you, Lydia, after we do this with Philip. Philip, pick a verse or a pericope that Lydia was explicating as something that supports her view, and then provide some concrete pushback on why you think that her explanation of that passage is not the correct one, or maybe not the most plausible one. And then let's turn it over to Lydia and let her pick apart one of the examples that Philip gave in defense of his view. So I just wanted to make this very concrete. Let's get into some of the details.
Yeah, thanks. All really interesting. And just to mention, I meant to mention in my presentation that the paper of mine is Christianity and a God of Limited Powers. That's on my website if people are interested in looking up on that. I think just another quick comment that's might be interesting to people is one thing Lydia and I do agree on is rejecting the minimal facts view can get you to the traditional view of the resurrection, right? So if you agree with Lydia that the minimal facts can't get you to the resurrection, but you agree with Gary Habermas, for example, that we should be pushing a minimal facts view, then you could get quite close to my view. Anyway, I just want to throw that in. But no, sorry, let's get concrete. So a couple of things, if I could just focus on a couple of very specific things Lydia's focused on in response. So one is she's trying to say, well, these are very different from other grief hallucinations or whatever. Well, one thing is to say these weren't just any old grief hallucinations. On my view, reality had been transformed. There was this possibility of radical new unity with God, and these people had been prepped for it by God incarnate. So this is a very, very unique situation. So it's not surprising to me that certain pretty unique things happen. But now coming very specifically to people being invited to touch Jesus, it's not obvious to me either in Luke's gospel where that happens or in the doubting Thomas passage. It's not obvious to me that everyone's hearing in exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Maybe many of them are having this sense of Jesus inviting them to touch him. Maybe that's part of to do with what Jesus prepped them to receive. But it's not obvious, not totally obvious that they're all hearing at exactly the same time, or everyone heard what Thomas heard. I'm following up. So I noticed, I thought Lydia kind of made a bit of an argument from absence, which I thought Lydia and Tim have done very good work, kind of rejecting kind of arguments from absence. They seem to be saying we never find a place where somebody's hearing Jesus talk to them, and someone else says, "What? I can't hear anything. I can't hear anything." Well, that seems to be an argument from absence that I thought Lydia didn't like. And in fact, I think something that does kind of fit quite well with that is in each of the Gospels we have doubting, right? And we have in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is there in front of them, but some of them are doubting. So I think this does fit quite well with the visionary idea that some people are, oh my God, Jesus is speaking to me. And others are like, what? I don't get it. Oh, I get it. So I think that fits quite well. But I think that perhaps the core issue that we're disagreeing on is, so Lydia's saying these people wouldn't have just made stuff up. So with Jesus eating fish, this is not, I really like the argument actually. Well, I don't agree with it, but it was an interesting way of pushing the argument that if Luke's trying to deal with the Gnostics, he's not going to say try and persuade them by making something up and then say, no, it didn't really happen. But it's obviously to me that's what he's trying to do. I'm not saying he's trying to convince anybody. I'm just thinking he's strongly expressing that this wasn't Gnosticism and this is his way of doing it. So I want to connect it to the Magnificat. And I do want to ask, Lydia, what does she think of that? What was that exactly what Mary said, those 10 verses? So I suppose, and why can't I see that analogously to a sort of statement of anti-Gnosticism that Luke is making here? And then just quickly, very, very finally, John's Gospel. I think my hypothesis can have your cake and eat it, because yes, there was a source of testimony, but there's also a community involved in this. So there can be embarrassment, there can be different things going on, there can be politics, and so you can have both. And
liars.
Yes. Well, maybe there's a bit of lie in there. But what about the Magnificat?
Okay.
Well, actually, before Lydia, you come back on the Magnificat, I was going to ask Philip to give his thoughts on the episode that you mentioned at the end of John's Gospel, where Peter puts on his coat before he gets in the water. Philip, what are your thoughts on that one? And that was what I meant by concrete. Like, I wanted to get into the actual evidence that Lydia raised in support of her theory, or in support of her claim that the Bible is, generally highly reliable.
It's a really good really good point that has some force. Like many of these undesigned concepts, think, oh yeah, that has some force. And Cameron invited me, if I had a higher pride for the traditional view, how much force would these have on me? And I sort of think it has some force, but nowhere near enough force to persuade me that this actually happened. I mean, maybe it could have been some symbolic point about putting the coat on that we're not clear of. Maybe. I'm not saying that's the most obvious interpretation. It's an interesting, obscure point. Yeah, you're right. It does seem, but I don't think that has anywhere near enough force to counter, my very low prior in the traditional view.
Okay.
So would you say that it's more probable than not that he put on his coat before he got in the water, or would you just be?
I don't think this happened. I don't think this happened at all. Yeah,
I think the whole scene is made up.
Yeah, I think the epilogue story is made up as a result of this embarrassment that the beloved disciple, the hero, died when he wasn't supposed to die till Jesus came back. So there's,
despite
what Lydia, what are we going to do?
Despite what she's bringing up. Yeah, despite what Lydia's bringing up about the fact that this is just a very awkward thing to throw into that made up story.
What's the awkward thing to throw into the
code I was referring to?
Oh yeah, so look, but so that's the function, the reason for inventing this. But there's loads of symbolism in it. The other thing I want to ask you about is the Magnificat and the exact number of fish. I think there's clearly some symbolism going on in there. Here's another example in the same epilogue, saying to Peter 3 times, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. What did he actually say? That it seems sort of theatrical and silly. I think there's some symbolism going on here, and I think one or more people, I mean, yes, you can't, I think you need to have both things in mind. You can't ignore the case that Lydia and others have made that there's strong historical accuracy here, but there's also bloody loads of symbolism. And my hypothesis that there's an elderly source of testimony, but also a community co-writing this, I think it accounts for both things. There's clearly a lot of symbolism in there.
So there are so many things that Philip just brought up, and what I know is going to happen is after we're done and we get off, I'm going to be like kicking myself, and I'm going to go, "Oh, I meant to say something about that. It didn't get to it." So I'll do my best. So I'll start with this analogy that Philip's trying to draw between Mary's Magnificat and the whole thing about Jesus saying, "Touch me and handle me," and so forth. One is, I think Luke certainly could have talked to Mary. In fact, I think Mary was alive throughout Jesus' ministry, and Acts places her at the day of Pentecost specifically. So I think Joseph was dead by then, but Mary was alive. And I think it's entirely plausible, and Richard Bauckham does as well, that Luke talked with Mary, like personally talked with Mary. I think he would have had the opportunity to do that. So that's got a, plausible prior. And that being the case, I think she can give him some idea. And a lot of times I think there's this kind of straw man. Was it absolutely verbatim? And then you say, well, no, it wasn't absolutely verbatim. And the person switches over to, so he just made it up to symbolize something. And like, there's a lot of in-between territory that's being, that's being left out. It's like a false dilemma. There would have been opportunity for Mary to tell him. And I said something like, and there are a lot of allusions to the Psalms. The Magnificat is just filled with psalmic language, okay? And so, she could even say, well, I was thinking of this part in the Psalms, and I was thinking of this part in the Psalms, and I was just so happy, and so forth, and tell him something of what she said, which we have as the Magnificat. I don't consider that to be so far out that I'm like, oh my gosh, he must have just made that up to symbolize something. But also, the story in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts 1, where Jesus ascends into heaven, it's making a point by narrating stuff that, as Philip himself has said, is very much in your face. Now, the simplest explanation for Luke's concluding that Jesus was bodily raised, and Philip thinks he believed that too. I think he believed that. Philip thinks he believed that. Not just raised as some form of energy or a single photon or whatever, but bodily raised in a body that then needed to leave the earth. The simplest explanation is that he had been told from people in a position to know that these kinds of things happened. And they tell him this stuff about Jesus inviting them to hold him with his, bones and so forth. And they bring him fish and so forth, and that he himself believed that those really happened, because those things justify you. I believe if that really happens to a group of people with their friend who was crucified days ago and its dead body was put in a tomb for several days, it's very reasonable for them to think that he was bodily raised from the dead. And so we don't have to invoke what I consider to be this very weird ad hoc idea of Luke going, well, I think, heaven knows why, that Jesus was bodily raised. Now, therefore, since I think Jesus was bodily raised, maybe some stuff happened that would look like he was bodily raised. So I'm going to kind of fill that out as a confession of my personal faith that he was bodily raised. And then he seamlessly weaves it into his narrative in such a fashion that neither in Luke nor in the first chapter of Acts does one have any a reader or a hearer, they read these things aloud, have any reason to doubt that he intends to be narrating literal historical fact. It's not like he turns on a little red button up in the corner, this part is the made up part, or whatever. The simplest is that he had that personal opinion because he had evidence for that personal opinion, and that what he narrates is evidence for that personal opinion. So this seems to me just a tremendously sort of ad hoc thing that Philip is bringing in. I wanted to comment briefly on arguments from silence. I have a video out there called Arguments from Silence, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so not only is what I'm saying not an argument from silence, I'll say why in a moment, but also there can be good arguments from silence. So an illustration I will use is, if I look around me right now and I don't see what seems to be a spider, that's a terrible argument that there's no spider in the room, because spiders are small, right? And I got a lot of books and stuff that spider could be anywhere, okay, in this room. But if I look around me and I don't see a full-grown elephant in this room, it's a very good reason to think that there is not a full-grown elephant in this room, because a full-grown elephant would take up way more space. So that's a good argument from silence. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, we have all this evidence in the other direction. Philip himself said that his view isn't necessarily the best explanation or a better explanation than the bodily resurrection. So when you have these two combined things, you have evidence that looks very bodily, and you have nothing. And you would expect somebody to pause and say, oh, by the way, everybody heard Jesus invite them to touch him. And to be quite frank, by the standard that Dr. Allison is using, and to some extent that Philip is using, if you did have that in there, they could go, well, that's really in your face, so it was probably an apologetic embellishment. I mean, it's almost like the very goodness of the evidence is being used against the goodness of the evidence. That the stronger and more insistent the authors are that this was really bodily, then that's like, well, then maybe that was just made up. And so it's almost like there's nothing they can say and nothing they can do to make it sufficiently clear that, yeah, they're really saying that this happened, and yeah, Jesus really was present bodily. For one thing, if they had an intense experience of Jesus that was visionary, and Jesus in that intense experience appeared in this really, really literal way to them and was like, bring me some fish. And he seemed to eat it. It looks like his feet are standing right on the floor. And, like in all that detail, touch me and see, his spirit has not flesh and bones as you see that I have. Jesus would be deceiving them. I mean, because he'd be like insisting, I'm here in a body that you can access in these normal ways, but he's not there in a body that they can access in these normal ways. He's just like putting it into their brain. So that kind of objective vision theory, I think, is just a non-starter. And that's the reason why often these objective vision views are cojoined with a denial that certain portions of the texts were attested to by the original alleged witnesses at all. So they're kind of trimming that out, and then with the vagueness that remains, then they do an objective vision view.
So let's let Philip come back now, and then after that, I want to give Philip a little bit of time to respond, and then I want Lydia, if you have like a specific passage in mind that Philip went through in his presentation that you'd like to push back on, I'd like to give you that opportunity.
There's so much to talk about. I want to resist the idea that the people were being deceived by these visions. I mean, I think that the best access we have to the content of a resurrection vision is through what Paul says, because Paul puts himself on the list of someone who has a resurrection experience. And I get the sense when I read that, I think that fits very well with the view I'm describing, that it's physical, but there's a sense of continuity and radical change. This metaphor of the seed and the wheat, continuity of radical change and different kinds of physicality. You know, he talks about the physicality of the heavenly bodies, and then there's the change between the natural body and the spiritual body. There's difficult how to understand this exactly, but there's so just because it's consistent, I think, to say the first disciples had this sense, it was as though Jesus was breathing on them. It was as though Jesus was inviting them to touch him. That doesn't mean they literally thought he was there bodily in the way Luke did, right? That's not the argument. But I'm just saying what Luke is trying to do. Luke has received this information, many decades ago, that this was physical. That's what's crucial to him. And I think I want to take the two together, the resurrection and the ascension, because I just think, well, I'd be interested to know what Lydia thinks about the ascension. Did someone really go up in the sky? I think it has to be true. I think it has to be true that nobody witnessed the ascension, right? If the ascension is going to heaven, given that heaven is not up there, even if Jesus did float up, that was not him going to heaven. He must have gone up, gone behind a cloud, and then gone to heaven, dematerialized like the TARDIS. Sorry, a bit facetious there. So no one actually saw the ascension. So what is going on? It's surely the more natural thing to think is Luke's trying his best to work this out, and he's not lying. He's not making things up. Well, he is making things up, kind of. He's doing his best to convey what happened. Well, and I think it's very plausible. It's just overwhelmingly plausible what I'm saying about the ascension, that nobody really went up, because why would Jesus do that? Some kind of theatrical show or something. And I want to say the same about the resurrection body, because it fits with how I'm thinking about it, that Luke was a bit wrong on what a resurrection body is. I think fits well with what Paul says. I think fits well with what Jesus says, that, what's going on there when he says we're not married or given in marriage, we're like the angels in heaven. I mean, here's a question, right? And I'm not being silly here, does the resurrected body have genitals, right? We don't get married. We presumably we don't have genitals. Do we have, what else don't we have? Usually when Jesus says something, there's a deeper thing going on underneath, right? Was he just saying, oh, you can't have sex when you're resurrected? I think he's saying, look, you fools, it's nothing like you imagine. It has continuity, but it's nothing like you can imagine. We're not eating fish and, going to the toilet and stuff. So I think the whole thing together, it's not just my priors. I think the whole thing fits together very well. And I would very much like to know whether Lydia thinks someone went up.
Yeah, let's hold off on the ascension question though, and let's let Lydia target one of your passages that you tried to explain, and then we will get to the ascension, I promise.
So this is going to be related to the ascension, really. I want to talk about Jesus breathing, and I'm glad you said this in your presentation, because you also say it in your paper. That it's theatrical, and you've used the word theatrical a couple of times here in our conversation. Prior to Jesus' death, Jesus was very theatrical. And I want to take an example here. There are examples related to alleged miracles and related to things that needn't be in and of themselves miracles. So I think a really good example here would be the words of institution of the Lord's Supper. Now, I'm not trying to beg any questions. I'm a real presence person. Cameron's Catholic, so transubstantiation. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about what happened on that night. And Jesus is sitting there. If you had a video camera, he hasn't even died yet, so you could videotape him. He picks up bread, and he says, "This is my body, which was given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Okay, and he breaks it, he gives it to them, and then he picks up a cup of wine and he goes, "This is my blood. Do this," and it's really weird. Okay, that's theatrical. It's extremely theatrical. Jesus does that kind of thing all the time. He washes their feet on that same night. Again, not in and of itself a miracle. And he says, "Do you know what I have done to you?" And it's weird. It's like he's investing it with some kind of metaphysical significance. And he even says to Peter, "Unless I wash your feet, you have no part of me." What's that? Was it literally necessary that Jesus have washed Peter's feet in order for Peter's sins to be forgiven, or in order for him to be unified? We can always push on these things and say, was that really Jesus' body? Some people say yes, and some people say no. But what remains unquestioned is that he said that, or he said those words. And the same way with, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me. When Jesus in one of his miracles is going to heal a guy who's mute, he touches his tongue. Oh, was that necessary? Like, he couldn't be healed unless Jesus touched his tongue? We can do this all day long. The point is, there are many, many examples throughout the Gospels, some associated with miracles, some not, where Jesus is super theatrical. And you're just going to have to say they're all made up if you're going to say Jesus was never theatrical. Jesus was very theatrical. So similarly, why not? Okay, that's what the passage seems to be saying. It's woven seamlessly. It says when it happened. It says that Jesus showed them his hands and his side, blah, blah, blah. It just weaves it right into the literal narrative that he's standing there and he breathes and he says, "Receive the Holy Ghost." To me, this is of a piece with, "This is my body. If I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me." And so I think this distaste for theatricality is not in keeping with the character of Jesus. Maybe you don't like it, but that's what the character of Jesus was like. And I think, and just like his means of teaching, his mode of teaching, he goes and gets a child. He's like, "Come over here, kid." And he puts them in front of them. Okay. And he says, "Unless you become as a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Like right there. That's how he rolled. And I think this relates to the ascension as well. So I can kind of put it all together, where I think Philip has not done a good job accounting for the passage of Jesus breathing. He's kind of like waffling, like, well, maybe they really felt like Jesus was breathing on them, sort of a sense, but it wasn't really like it's recorded there. It was some kind of visionary thing that they could only express. Come on, the way it's recorded there is clear. It's very clear what phenomenologically it seemed that they were experiencing. That she's going, oh, you don't like that? Talk to Jesus. And similarly with the ascension, again, Jesus does things to convey things in ways that people are going to understand. A way that I often like to put it is, well, let's suppose Jesus did rise bodily, and let's suppose that he was going to then leave our space-time dimension, go into another universe, like TARDIS, if you will, but going to go outside so that you couldn't then find him just by going around somewhere in our space-time dimension. Would it have been better if he had shrunk and disappeared? Would it have been better if he traveled east and he seemed to go away from them until he disappeared? Etc. Would it have been better if he had sort of got fuzzy around the edges, like in Star Trek where they're beaming somebody? Okay, he's going to have to do something to communicate to them. This isn't just me, going away temporarily and then later I'm going to come back and have another fish dinner with you. This is different. This is distinct. And he's warned them ahead of time. I'm going to go back to the Father. I'm going to go back to the Father. And he's told them, the Holy Spirit isn't going to come to empower you fully for your work until I go back to the Father. And he says, stay in the city. So it's like he's leaving them these last words until the gift is given from heaven. Okay, so he's doing everything he can to convey that this time it's different, that he is leaving. And that's clearly what they understand. Luke reports them as understanding that. In Acts, that's why Luke reports and makes it clear. It's a very consistent story that Paul's type of experience is not of Jesus having a meal with him, but if you take Luke and Acts and put them together, that their experience was. Peter says it in one of his speeches. He appeared to us with whom he ate and drank. It's in his speech to Cornelius in Acts 10. So it's this very consistent picture, and Jesus needed to convey that to them. So I don't feel that kind of weird contempt for Jesus going up and it goes behind a cloud and then he left our space-time continuum, because he had to do something to convey that he was leaving our space-time continuum, that he was, as they put it, going to heaven.
Philip, what do you think about that response from theatrics, and then that he had to communicate somehow that he was going somewhere for a while?
I think the examples of theatricality, alleged theatricality, Lydia has added there, seem to me very different. I mean, the Eucharist is what a wonderful, beautiful, rich symbol to pass on, to start the church. In my view, it was to symbolize theosis and a symbolic eating and drinking. What a wonderful, he's got to give us something, especially because he's got limited power. He's got to leave us some rich, wonderful symbolism to move forward, washing the feet, to a physical act of humility. I love Lydia, your undesigned coincidence on this. That is one I find very convincing. It connects with in the other gospel where they're arguing about who's great, and Jesus said, la. I'm going to show you what greatness is. I'm going to wash your feet. Beautiful. Actually, with the touching the tongue, maybe that had to be done. I think God has limited powers. I think we find in the Gospels, Jesus struggles to do miracles if people aren't kind of on board with it. He goes to his hometown and he can't do any miracles. So maybe this was part of, come on, you got to be on board with it. Whereas, Aeneas suddenly disappearing when they recognize him. Oh, you've recognized me now? Whew, like a magician at the end of an act, or floating up to heaven, or breathing on people. Look, to me, and people will just judge for themselves, if we could tell a story that removes that theatricality, the visionary story, a vision of as though being breathed on, suddenly losing the vision, and you lose, oh no, he's gone. That removes that theatricality. To my mind, that is a plus point. But in all of these, like with many of the undisguised coincidences, it's sort of, you can see it on both sides. I think the presence of doubting fits better with my view, but it's not an overwhelming argument. Or the only case I'm trying to make is that I'm giving an adequate account of the data. I'm not going to say it's better. And I think these things are part of what, plus points on my side, in my view, although people would have to judge for themselves. I think I forgot to say with the Ascension, actually, that I'd also be curious to know what Lydia thinks is, well, look, I think there's a sign here that Luke doesn't care about exactly what happened in the way a modern journalist would, because the end of Luke's gospel, on the face of it, the resurrection and the ascension happen in a day, whereas in the start of Acts, it's 40 days and 40 nights. Now, clearly, this isn't something he didn't notice. I just sort of think he didn't care about, that wasn't important, that kind of level of detail. Also, I'm interested in Lydia's on that. I'm also interested in Lydia, finally, on so many things to say on if they did receive the Holy Spirit at the first appearance in John's Gospel, how does that square with, I probably should have just, Lydia's probably written this somewhere, how does that square with Pentecost? Because, to my mind, this fits better with the idea that they're receiving the Holy Spirit. In the Last Supper monologue, Jesus said, "Oh, you're lucky I'm going, because you won't get the Holy Spirit till I go." On the face of it, the most straightforward reading of what's going on here, and when he's talking to Mary Magdalene a moment before the first appearance of the disciples, he says, "Tell your brothers I'm ascending to the Father. Don't touch me yet." And then, I think the most straightforward reading this is during the first appearance, the ascension has already happened, and that's why they can receive the Holy Spirit. Anyway,
so there's so many things
Lydia,
here. Yeah.
Do you mind if you just hold that thought just really quickly? Because I want to ask.
Thoughts. I'm going to forget. You should make notes of everything you just said, Philip, and then give me a chance to respond to each one, or else I'm going to forget some of them. All right, go ahead, Cameron.
Well, I was just going to ask Philip, what do you make of the empty tomb? Do you think that the tomb was empty? I just wanted to help to sort of flesh out your full theory.
I am inclined to believe in an empty tomb. I think there's fairly good evidence. I don't think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that if I was an atheist, I would deny it. So I don't think it's like absolutely overwhelming. But actually, I think an empty tomb does fit with the view I find plausible with theosis. And, the idea that, okay, Jesus become God and the physical universe come together and then the body just rots away. That doesn't seem to fit with this permanent change in reality, the possibility that theosis signifies. So I'm already inclined to it fits well with my view that there's an empty tomb. And I think there's good evidence that for example, the different gospel writers refer to different women. They don't just follow Mark. I think that Bauchman focuses on. I think that's, fairly good evidence that there was a historical reality here.
Did God do that on your view? Did God make the tomb empty?
Oh, so this is something I didn't get into in the detail. This is what I go into in the paper. A little bit more, I got into this in my debate with Craig. I was just doing a talk on this in Notre Dame University, and I've developed the view a bit more. I want to update the paper. Yeah, basically, very roughly, there's a lot more detail to this, but very roughly, I think God has the capacity to become incarnate in a particular individual, and then, as it were, I'm speaking very roughly, I say this more precisely in the paper, as it were, reabsorb that now physical individual. So Craig said to me, why didn't God dematerialize Hitler? But Hitler wasn't God incarnate, right? So God can become fused with a bit of physical reality and then reunify with that bit of that now physical bit of God's self, right? So that's roughly what, and I try to cash that out in. So I've got to expand God's it's a challenge for me, this, because I've got to extend God's powers a bit to make sense of all this, but I don't want it to extend them so much that we get back to the problem of evil. I try to do that in the paper.
Philip, if you don't mind, help me remind us what your points were in response earlier, so that Lydia's we can help Lydia out from this tangent. Unless you're ready to go, Lydia.
Well, I'll list a few of them, and then he could tell me if I miss one that he already said. No new points. So we can wrap it up. Okay. So one of them was Jesus talking to Mary Magdalene, and that he thinks that sounds more like he's already ascended. What he says to Mary Magdalene, I think it's better translated as "stop clinging to me." And I think that even fits with what happened with the other women in Matthew, although I don't think she was with them at the time. I think there was a larger group, and then they separated from each other. But it says they came and took him by the feet. And she's been just overwhelmed with recognizing him. She's like been crying, and now she's so excited. And so it's very understandable that she grabs hold of him. And then he says, "Stop clinging to me." And so I don't think it looks like he's ascended there at all. Let's see. Another one was...
he also responded to the theatrics point.
Okay, yeah, that he thinks that this is... that these other things are somehow justified theatricality. And then what do I think about, like, did the Holy Ghost not really come when he breathed on them? So
that's what I'm interested in. How does it connect to Pentecost?
Right, how does it connect to Pentecost? The allegation of a contradiction there is a theological allegation. I do want to just emphasize it's not a physical contradiction. It's not like, well, Jesus said, Jesus was here in this story, and in this story he's somewhere else, or something like that. It's bringing in a theological principle, and the unstated theological principle there is that if Jesus breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Ghost, whoever sins you, retain, they retain," and blah blah blah, that this has to be the getting of the Holy Ghost. And then there can only be one of those gettings of the Holy Ghost. So there was an interview that Craig Keener did with Mike Licona one time. It was kind of interesting because I think Mike thought that Craig Keener thought that was made up, that it didn't really happen. And you can kind of see that in the dynamics of the interview. And Craig Keener goes, "I'm a holiness Pentecostal. I think people have lots of encounters with the Holy Ghost," right? And it's like, well, fair enough. So that it depends on your theology of what was happening. Jesus says that they have the power to retain or forgive sins. I'm going to hand it to the Catholic. I don't believe that you have to auricularly confess your sins to someone who's in the apostolic succession, but that verse is about the strongest Bible verse that they have on that point, the need for auricular confession. So Jesus is giving them something, right? But Pentecost is clearly a different kind of thing. It's a larger group, a much larger group. They speak in tongues after they receive it. It's even something that can then happen later to Cornelius and his family. So it's not this highly specific thing just for those apostolic leaders. So there are all kinds of differences such that I think they were still expecting something else to happen even after that. They were, and especially since Jesus then meets later with this larger group. I think that's why the appearance in Matthew is outdoors, because it can accommodate a larger group of people, and he may not have breathed on them. I don't see any reason to think that he did. So Pentecost is going to empower all of those early believers to spread his word. Now, the third one, maybe this will be all about the alleged contradiction between Luke 24 and Acts 1, as allegedly meaning that Luke doesn't care very much about literal truth. I would say it's exactly the opposite. I would say that Luke realized that he got rushed. And by the way, you can feel that rush. Start at 24:44 in Luke 24 and just kind of start reading. And it's like all of a sudden, he's been doing this kind of blow-by-blow thing. And then all of a sudden it ceases to be blow by blow. And we have this kind of what I call and narration. And he uses which Sean Wenham says would be better not to translate. If you read it in a translation that translates that as then, as if it happened right away, that's wrong. He just seems to be like chunking stuff in. Maybe he was trying to catch a boat to give, send his manuscript to Theophilus. And his manuscript there is about the length of a scroll. Maybe he was running out of scroll. And at that time, there can be somewhat of a gap of time between the two books, he may not have had a real clear idea of how long Jesus was on earth. I think we do see that all the things that are recounted, with it already being evening by the time they invite Jesus to stay for supper, and then he gives this big sermon and opens the scriptures to them, that it's going to be getting late. The sun is going to be set. So I think even the internal markers in Luke 24, when you're on the alert, show that he's just stuffing a lot of things in. He's not really trying to convey that this definitely happens all on the same day. That's just a first impression you could get. But then he finds out he has more opportunity to gather information. He realizes it was not even just a few days. It was about 6 weeks. And he wants to be sure to convey that to Theophilus. So he says, the former treatise I have made, blah, 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 most excellent Theophilus. And then he expands and says things more clearly in Acts 1. I think that actually shows his scrupulousness. And indeed, if you read Luke 24 as conveying that it all happened on one day, the simplest explanation, if you were right about that, is that at that time Luke thought it did happen on one day, and that he was mistaken. And so there's, again, if you're not making this false dilemma between inerrancy on the one hand and Luke didn't really care that much about changing the facts on the other hand, very false dilemma. There's lots of space in between. You could take that view. I don't happen to think that's the best view. I think he's just narrating in a rushed fashion, but then makes it clear in Acts 1. But that would be my answer to that.
So unfortunately, with the nature of these types of conversations, we could go for another 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. But unfortunately, we do have to just stop at some point. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to actually turn it over to some closing statements. We're going to start with Philip for his closing thoughts on this conversation, and then turn it over to Lydia. And then maybe in the future, we'll do maybe a part 2. We'll just have to see how things play out. But Philip, let's turn it over to you for your closing thoughts.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I do very much admire and enjoy Lydia's work, and it's given me lots to think about. There's not enough time to talk about all this. I think where I end up with this, though, is I think there are some data that are more favorable to the traditional view. Maybe eating fish in Luke is points in that direction. A little bit harder for me to account for. I also, though, think there's things, and these have come up, that fit better with my view. I think the ascension, Jesus going up there when we know heaven isn't up there, and that would sort of fit with how people at the time thought heaven was, and the prima facie contradiction between the length of time at the end of Luke's gospel and beginning of Acts. 40 days and 40 nights, is a I meant to say there's a well-known symbolic thing that, Luke could have been bringing in there. So I think that those things fit a bit better with my view on John's gospel. The fact that, there's the big point in the Last Supper monologue, when I go, you'll receive, you want me to go, I'm paraphrasing, because then you'll receive the Holy Spirit. And the first appearance, they received the Holy Spirit. On the face, and both of these things I've just said, there are things Lydia can said, and she did say, and it's not a knockdown argument, but I think it's more favorable to. I think on the face of it, if you're just looking at John's gospel, you would think, oh well, the ascension's already happened, and that's why they're receiving the Holy Spirit. You've got to do a little bit of playing around, and just I think that it was John. It was the author of John. It was John's gospel where we have a disciple testimony really directly informing what's going on. So I'm going to trust that one over Luke, who I think did talk to some eyewitnesses, but not clear to me talked to the original disciples on Easter Sunday morning. And so, it's plausible to me that he was just sort of doing a bit of reconstruction. So I think, look, there's things that can go on both sides. All I've tried to say is that I think I can give an adequate account of the data. Fundamentally, I do think what is really strong, and this is my final thing. Oh, just finally, I do think my view, it's a real big judgment call, but I think it fits better with what Paul says about the resurrected body and what Jesus says when the Sadducees ask, what if a woman's been married 7 times? it doesn't seem plausible to me. It's just that I'm talking to my sensus divinitatis now, that in the final ultimate end state of existence, we'll still have hands and intestines and stuff. I don't know. And I think that fits with what Jesus says. But anyway, the final point is what I think is really strong and strong support for the truth of Christianity is basically the minimal facts. There's a strong historical case that a fair number of people had experiences that persuaded them that he was alive again in some sense and vigorously motivated them to vigorously defend this for decades against violent opposition. That's really strong evidence. Where you then go with that depends on your priors. If you've got a strong prior for, and I agree with Richard Swinburne on this actually. If you've got a strong prior for the traditional view, you go for the traditional view. If you have different priors, you might end up with my view. So, but that's still pretty optimistic.
All right, let's turn it over to Lydia.
So there are a couple things I want to say in wrapping up. First of all, I think when you take what Phillips called the traditional view, the bodily resurrection, seriously as a hypothesis, just in then relating it to the data, very natural explanations for various things arise. For example, to say that if you just read John's gospel, you would think that Jesus had already ascended because of what he said at the Last Supper, to me doesn't make any sense at all. You could say it seems to contradict what he said at the Last Supper. I don't think it does either, but for theological reasons. But the description of the scene doesn't look like he's ascended at all. The description of the scene looks like he's literally standing there, breathing on them. So it doesn't look like he's already ascended. So again, we have to take seriously the apparently literal nature of what's actually narrated there. Similarly, I think this helps us to answer questions like, well, why didn't Jesus, if he was there bodily, why didn't he appear to millions of people or thousands of people? Well, because millions of people and thousands of people could not attest that he was really Jesus of Nazareth. He hadn't known millions of people and thousands of people intimately. That's why Peter in Acts emphasizes we got to elect somebody to replace Judas who has been with us through Jesus' ministry and then can also attest to the resurrection. It's that, knowing that it's who it is and so forth, and then attesting that he really was raised. Thousands of people seeing Jesus could say it looked like there was some guy there, but they couldn't say who it was. Peter emphasizes this in his speech as well, not to all the people, but to those of us with whom he ate and drank and so forth in his speech to Cornelius. So I think this all just kind of fits together in this extremely natural way with the data that we have. And to say otherwise, it ends up kind of distracting away from the way that the scenes are actually described. And I think that same feeling of distraction occurs when you try to have it both ways. You try to say Luke was making up this scene of the ascension, but he wasn't lying. The disciples of John or the Johannine community was making up the whole scene of the fish and stuff just for the punchline of Jesus saying, if it's my will that he stay till I come, what is that to you? And then emphasizing what was in that punchline and what wasn't. But they weren't lying somehow. It's that we have to fuzzify our view of the data and of the very literal appearance of the data and the appearance of them taking that literalness seriously in things like that little coda at the end of John, which, if nothing else, reflects the views of a very early audience of the gospel, or the things that Luke says and so forth. And then you're trying, in a sense, to have it both ways. So I think that kind of stuff informs our Bayes factor and unifies our view of these documents and of the authors who wrote them in a way that other views just really can't do.